Okay, we're starting chapter 29. We're getting closer and closer to that end game here. We're pretty excited. Okay, chapter 29, starting with number one. We're going to start with the early 1960s. John Dewey wasn't from the 1960s. That's not when he first started. He's actually going to start in the 20s and 30s. But by the 60s, his teachings are going to be permeating all of public education. He called it progressive education, and he was using the term that was based on the political party that was progressivism. Okay, the political party was not the Progressive Party. It was I'll have to think about it later. But this idea of progressive education actually goes backward in its theories rather than forward. Before this time, people were taught according to traditional education. Traditional takes the whole scope of man's knowledge and transfers that to each generation coming up. So this is what we know. Here's what you need to know. Okay, so here's what we've already discovered. Progressive education basically tells the student you need to rediscover everything that we've already learned. And it actually sets people backward a little bit. There's also an issue with progressive education where it looks at the student as an animal. Didn't really go there. Okay, looks at the student as an animal. So that students should learn on instinct. They should be able to behave according to their animal biology. And as a result, students weren't to be trained or formed in any way when it came to issues of morality or behavior. And as a result, we ended up with a lot of kids, especially in the early 1960s, who were really without any kind of moral standard in the public school system, unfortunately. Okay, in 1962, the Supreme Court removed prayer from public schools, and the woman who was the most outspoken opponent of prayer in public schools was this lady. Her name was Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was an American who was a strong believer in atheistic communism. The neighborhood she lived in was almost all refugee people who had moved to the United States for an opportunity at freedom. And many of the people from that neighborhood were actually people who had escaped from communism. So they could not understand why an American born and raised in the country of the USA would, for any reason, adopt communism or atheism as the right way to go. And they were constantly trying to encourage her to rethink her position. She didn't care about their thought process whatsoever. And she used her sons as a way to force her belief system on everybody else by saying that her sons were having belief systems forced on them. Now, let me just back up and explain exactly what happened in public schools before 1962. First thing in the morning, children, after the Pledge of Allegiance was actually adopted by the Congress, children in public schools would do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag. Now, it was later that Under God was actually included in that pledge. The original pledge did not have that, but Congress actually is the one that added that. So students would stand up and they would do the Pledge of Allegiance, pledging their allegiance to the country and specifically to the flag that represents the country. Then the teacher would read a proverb or a psalm out of the Bible. And sometimes students would get that privilege of reading a psalm or a proverb out of the Bible, usually just one or two verses. And then the teacher would pray for blessings on the day, and that was it. Now, people of every race, every ethnicity, and every religion had the same public school experience. Kids who were Jewish, who were in public schools rather than Jewish schools, had absolutely no problem with the prayer and Bible reading because the Bible was part of the Old Testament that was being read. Their prayers, they just, they prayed to the same God. Kids who were Muslim really didn't have a problem with this because, again, the Old Testament is used in Muslim culture. So there were a lot of people who had no problem with this at all. In fact, they did a poll and they found out that it was like 2% of Americans had a problem with this. But Madalyn Murray O'Hair had a problem, and she was not going to let it go. So she said, my child should not be exposed to that religion. She hated the Bible, absolutely hated it. She said it was full of violence and misogyny and should never be read by anybody who had any kind of sense whatsoever. But she herself was a very mean and abusive person. Her son later got away from her, and basically apologized to everyone for his role in this because he was a kid. He had to do what his mom said. And he said, my mom was an incredibly violent, awful human being, honestly. In 1963, the Supreme Court banned Bible reading from public schools as well as prayer. This specific Supreme Court is actually going to make a lot of decisions that the majority of Americans are not going to agree with. And one of those would be removal of prayer, and the other is removal of the Bible in public schools. So this is Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She lived well into the 80s when she went missing, and they believe that she was killed by a couple of her followers, including her daughter and her daughter's boyfriend were also killed at the same time. But Madalyn Murray O'Hair, she was an atheist and a communist. She used her teenage son William to protest daily Bible reading and prayer in public schools of Baltimore, Maryland. And her quote is, religion has ever been anti-human, anti-woman, anti-life, anti-peace, anti-reason, and anti-science. The God idea has been detrimental not only to humankind, but to the earth. It is time now for reason, education, and science to take over. So this is someone who has read the Bible. If she's read it at all, she read it with the mindset of this Bible is anti-human, anti-woman, anti-life, anti-peace, anti-reason, and anti-science. I read the Bible through every year, and I find none of that statement to be true. In 1963, individual prayer and Bible reading in public schools was banned. There were two separate cases that were combined for the ruling of banning both individual prayer and reading of the Bible in public schools. The individual school prayer was Murray versus Curlett, and that's Murray O'Hair. Madalyn O'Hair is the most known for her involvement in that case. Bible reading was from the Abington Township School District versus Shemp. And it was later determined in 1965 that a child could silently pray if no one could tell he was praying. If you were at lunch and you decided to say a prayer before you ate, you were in the wrong, according to this standard. If you had your eyes open and you kind of did it on the slide, that was okay. But you couldn't show an expression of faith in the public school, which it goes directly against the First Amendment. According to the First Amendment, the government is not allowed to prevent anybody from practicing their religion freely. A liberal Supreme Court ruled that even voluntary Bible reading and prayer were unconstitutional because they discriminated against non-Christians. This is baloney, because if you are voluntarily reading your Bible, you are not doing anything to anyone around you. You are reading to yourself. You are praying to God one-on-one with Him. It has nothing to do with discrimination against non-Christians. But the liberal Supreme Court is really pushing this idea that there should be absolutely no religion talked about or performed in a public setting, which is not what the Constitution actually believes, and it's not what the Founding Fathers believed at all. They are pulling this directly out of their own ideas for what they want America to be. They are completely skewing our original document. Progressive education removed godly values from the classroom. And as a result, America's youth became targets for a spirit of rebellion that moved across the nation in the late 1960s. It did open up the door to drug abuse and sexual immorality. You also have to remember that there was an issue after World War II where fathers and mothers were having a difficulty of reconnecting with each other. The economy was really great, but alcoholism was at an all-time high. So you have parents who were trying to present themselves one way to the world and living another way at home. And that is also going to cause a problem with rebelliousness. So it's not just progressive education. It's not just music. It's not just movies. There was a whole conglomeration of things that were going on that spurred this new, sorry, I'm losing my vowels here, or my nouns. It's promoting this idea of rebellion, and it really did explode across the United States. Sometimes rock and roll music is used as one of these symbols of rebellion, and in some cases that is true, but a lot of the reasons people are anti-rock and roll is because they just don't care for the type of music. Okay, ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, and they've been around for quite a long time, but it's a group of lawyers who actively defend extreme views of atheist, socialist, and communist minorities. And we saw this happening with the Scopes Monkey trial. They were part of that. Okay. In the 1960s, the ACLU began to use the courts to force local communities to stop making references to biblical values in public life. Local communities were not allowed to make references to biblical values in public life. They claimed that the United States Constitution established a wall of separation between church and state. And now people actually believe that the Constitution says that, even though it does not. It is nowhere in the Constitution at all. So this man, I'm really not familiar with who he is, but his quote is good. He says, thanks in large measure to the ACLU, the belief that there is a wall of separation between faith and state, not just church and state, is endemic. That means it's spread. The exercise of religious faith in the public square is not prohibited, only the federal imposition of a particular faith. That's what it really says. Hardly anyone any longer knows the difference. The Constitution never mentions a wall of separation between church and state. That was in a letter from Thomas Jefferson, who was writing to a church, a Baptist church, about a concern that they had about a Lutheran church in their neighborhood that was calling themselves the state church. And they said, we thought, according to the Constitution, there was no state church. State church meaning everybody pays tithe to that church because it's actually run by the state. And the Baptists were saying, we had a very different impression of what the Constitution said. And Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State at the time, said, no. If you go back to the Constitution, there is a one-way wall of separation between church and state. The state, it can be influenced by the church, but the church cannot be influenced by the state. And there is no state church. He was the one answering that letter. His name is on that, but he himself was not at the Constitutional Convention. So when people talk about Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Constitution, there's a separation of church and state, they're wrong on so many levels. It just makes your head spin. Be smarter than that. Okay, sorry, we're going on. In the presidential election of 1964, Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson ran against Barry M. Goldwater. Okay. So we have LBJ, he became president as a result of Kennedy's assassination, and he is running against a senator from Arizona. Now, there are going to be some issues in this election. Barry Goldwater is going to say that he believes in civil rights, but he doesn't believe it should be handled on a federal level. He did not think that segregation should be lifted based on a federal law. He believed that the states should have their own laws on that. That put him at odds with many people in the civil rights movement. Even though he believed in civil rights, he did not believe it should be a federally enforced issue, especially in the areas of desegregating schools. He believed that should be handled on the state level because schools were actually run on the state level, not in a federal level. That's why he believed that. He believed that putting the federal law into place on the school level put too much government oversight on the state. So he did not believe that. And he believed in civil rights, but not federally enforced civil rights. So the Democratic Party, seeing that they had a door open there, even though they had been very anti-integration this whole time, they basically encouraged Johnson to run on the civil rights issue, even though the majority of people in the Democratic Party did not agree with the civil rights issue. This was their way to get the votes. And so Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Republican, actually worked to get Johnson elected over Barry Goldwater because he saw that Johnson would do the civil rights on a federal level. Okay, do you understand what I hope you understand what I'm saying. He didn't agree with Goldwater. He didn't believe that Goldwater was a racist. In fact, he was very clear about that. I don't think the man's racist. I just don't agree with him that this should be handled by states. Okay, and coming from the South the way Martin Luther King Jr. did, I can understand his reasoning now because the states had that opportunity and they totally messed it up with all their little rules and their segregation that they did. So he wanted to see it happen on a federal level. So he instead, even though he was a Republican, he supported the Democrat candidate for president specifically because he wanted to see the Civil Rights Bill passed on a federal level. Okay, that was the big difference between these two men. Now, LBJ ended up winning the election by promising to continue the programs of the late JFK because they were very popular programs to a lot of people. And he himself pushed a lot of social welfare programs through Congress. I mean, pushed them through because, you know, his party controlled Congress at the time. Okay, much of it anyway. He was also a bit of a bully, we found out later. A lot of times we see presidents while they're actually in office, and we don't know a whole lot about them except for what we see like in press, you know, the newspapers and the in the news, but stuff comes out about them after they leave office. It really does. And LBJ was famous for a couple of things, like when he had no respect for somebody, he would have an office meeting with that person while LBJ himself was sitting on the toilet going to the bathroom to basically tell the guy, you are no more important to me than the poop that I'm pooping right now in the toilet. Okay, I want you to do this and this and this, and I don't care what you have to think about it. I don't care what you think about me. This, my bodily function, you have about the same rank. Okay, he was kind of gross that way. He was also took an infamous picture, and even the liberal press who liked LBJ were a little offended by this. He had some hound dogs that he was famous for because he was a Texan and he hunted a lot on his property, but he had these hound dogs, very nice dogs, but he picked up one of his dogs by the ears and kind of, you know, swung him around a bit. And the press was just like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And he's like, they like it. And the dog was obviously, you know, whining and in pain. And weirdly enough, there's actually a verse in Proverbs that says, beware of men who pick up dogs by their ears. And it's like, did he not know that was in the Bible? Yeah, because there was a cruelty there in him that was very obvious. Now, he worked with Martin Luther King Jr. On the civil rights bill that he was trying to get passed through Congress, but he hated Martin Luther King Jr. and he called him every vile name in the book you can think of. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't really care for LBJ, but he realized he had to work with the man in order to get the civil rights bill passed through Congress. So the two of them worked together, but they hated each other. Some of the social welfare programs that he started to pass while he was in office. When we look at the history of social welfare programs, we had the New Deal by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Frontier by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and now Lyndon Baines Johnson is going to start the Great Society, which is really funny because all of these are social welfare and they're all very socialistic in their thought process. And Great Society just sounds like a flat out, hey, I'm a socialist program. Now, his blueprint was to have billions of dollars of American taxpayer money given to schools, the aged, Medicare for the elderly and for the very poor, and a war on poverty. But a lot of his social welfare programs are actually going to increase poverty by quite a lot. The Great Society became the largest public welfare program since the New Deal. So Leonard Read, I'm not really sure, again, okay, he said oh, yes, I do. This is Read's rules. He was a senator. He was in the Congress anyway. He said such terms as communism, socialism, Fabianism, which is supposed to be a Christian form of socialism, the welfare state, Nazism, fascism, state interventionism, egalitarianism, the planned economy, the New Deal, the Fair Deal, the New Frontier are simply different labels for much the same thing. They're all forms of socialism, every one of these. That's why I put it on there, because the quote was like, you got it, dude. Okay, as the state and local governments accepted tax dollars from the federal government for new welfare programs, the government told them how to spend the money. So the government says, we have money to give you. And all of these state and local governments said, yay, we get money. And then the government would say, and this is how you're going to spend it. Oh, it's like you being told, I'm going to give you $1 million. Yay. And here's a list of how you can spend it. Oh, you don't get to spend on what you want? No. So a lot of these schools and state and local governments, they got the cash, but they gave up their freedom to run things the way they saw fit. So they surrendered their authority to Washington, D.C. So this gives you an idea of the Great Society programs. And yes, these are all part of his programs. When I was first married, Mr. S worked nights. And so I would basically stay up at night so, we could connect together in the daytime or, So I would stay up nights and I would watch a lot of documentaries. Yeah, that was my life. But I watched one documentary on LBJ and I thought, this is great because I really didn't know anything about this guy. And then they talked about, and then he passed this bill, and then he passed this bill, and then he passed this bill, and then he passed this bill. And at 19 years old, newly married and not the brightest person, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, no wonder we're in so much debt. I mean, that was my first thought was, oh my goodness, no wonder we're in so much debt. He had all of these spending programs that he just signed in one after the other. And it was really just ridiculous the way everything was just, there was a lot of stuff that was done. Look at the dates and you will get a sense of how fast he pushed through all of these bills. So let's start with health and welfare. In 1965, he established a comprehensive health insurance program for all elderly people, and it was financed through Social Security, taking that principle out of the Social Security pot. That was called Medicare. 1965, same year, funded by state and federal and state governments, provided health and medical assistance to low-income families. And then the Child Nutrition Act in 1966 established a school breakfast program that expanded on the school lunch program and milk program to improve poor children's nutrition. Now, when I was going to school, and I went to public school until I hit 9th grade. So when I was going to public school and we had a cafeteria that we went into, you had a choice. You could either bring your lunch or you could pay a very minimal amount of money to purchase lunch. Okay. It was a hot lunch program, but kids who couldn't even afford that minimal amount, they got a free lunch. Okay. It just depended, but there was a school lunch program and you got a good hearty meal for what you paid. But now it was extended to, you could also buy breakfast or you could also have breakfast provided for you. Okay. For education, in 1965, same year as all these, as two of the medical ones, targeted aid to students and funded related activities such as adult education and adult counseling. And that's, helping people who had dropped out of school to work or because they joined the military. Now they were getting secondary education aid for that to go back and get their diplomas. And then the Higher Education Act supported college tuition scholarships, student loans, and work study programs for low and middle income students. Before this, people could work part-time jobs and pay for their own college. Starting here, you're going to see the prices of tuition going up because schools are going to realize they can get money from the government and it's going to be matching funds for whatever your tuition is. We will give you so much money. So colleges are going to raise their tuition so they can get more money from the government. And that's why college is so stinking expensive now. You can trace it back to this. And then Project Head Start, which I was part of when I was growing up, It funded a preschool program for the disadvantaged. It really wasn't just for the disadvantaged, it's for everybody. But you just signed up and you went to Head Start, and it was a preschool. You learned your basics, okay? Okay, then you had the War on Poverty, 1964. Oversaw many programs to improve life in the inner cities, including a Job Corps, an education and job training program for at-risk youth. These are kids who might not be able to get hired in a regular business with the skills that they had, because they didn't really have any skills. So it was to give them skills. That's kind of a good thing. Housing and Urban Development Act established new housing subsidy programs, made federal loans and public housing grants easier to obtain. As a result of this, they started building these gigantic apartment buildings for the HUD, or Housing and Urban Development. Unfortunately, it just put a lot of people who really didn't have a lot of money all together in one area. And it was usually pretty far away from where people had to work. So they had to commute a lot. A lot of people just went on government assistance instead. There were no real playgrounds. Everything was like concrete and fenced off. And then there was issues with the schools in those areas. It basically just created these huge pockets of poverty. Then there were demonstration cities and Metropolitan Development Act. This helped revitalize urban areas through a variety of social and economic programs. Those did not work. Okay, and those were all 64, 65, 66. Same years. Consumer Environmental Protection. You had the Water Quality Act and Clean Air Acts. They supported development of standards and goals for water and air quality. They sound good on paper, but anytime you get a lot of these regulations, you're going to have people not able to build in a certain area because of, a fish or an issue with, some kind of animal living there. In the Air and Quality Act, they're going to be looking at it. If these were just about helping people to create a cleaner, less polluting business, that would be wonderful. But instead, it really just kind of went after businesses. And instead of helping them to create a better filtration, they just punished the companies instead. The Highway Safety Act has supported highway safety by improving federal, state, and local coordination and by creating training standards for emergency medical technicians. And then the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act required all consumer products to have true and informative labels. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that there is a new Packaging and Labeling Act that happens like every 5 to 6 years, where all of a sudden companies have to redesign and reapply all their labels. And they basically lose money because of the goods that weren't sold with the old label. Sometimes you'll see a company slashing the price on an item. And then once that item's gone, there's a brand new label on that. That's their way of trying to make at least break even on that item before they're required to change the label. This is the first time in the 1960s when local school districts accepted money from the federal government. Schools were always run by the local government and the state government, not by the federal government. But because the federal government is offering them money for hot lunches and those kinds of programs, they are going to start requiring the school systems to do certain things to live up to the standard of the federal government, not of their local government. And the people who live in the local government, those were the parents whose children were going to those schools. Now they are getting pushed out. They don't have as much say. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in public places, meaning places that were government run and owned. Okay, so here you see Martin Luther King Jr. is standing directly behind LBJ as he's signing this into law. And people often mistakenly think of Martin Luther King Jr. as a Democrat because he worked with a Democrat president, but he wasn't. He was a Republican. The president was a Democrat. They didn't like each other. LBJ called him every foul name you can think of. But let's break down what happened in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Democrats who were in Congress at the time hated this act. They were angry at the president that they had helped him get elected, and then he wants to have the Civil Rights Act passed. And they were furious at him, and they told him, we are not going to support you. Not at all. You're working with that guy. And then the Republicans who were in Congress were like, this is a fair act. This makes sense because if it's a federal place, that makes sense that we can have a federal law that would protect federal places, okay? Which is not how it was originally presented, because remember, that's one of the reasons that Goldwater objected to the Civil Rights Act, because he thought it was going to take over the rights of the states. So it had been amended a little bit, and now it was prohibition of racial discrimination in public places. In other words, places that were actually owned by the federal government. So when it came down to the time to vote, the Democratic Party had a man stand up, and he did what is called, he talked incessantly. Oh my goodness. I'll think about it and I'll shout it out like I've got history Tourette's here in a second. This man got up and he just spoke constantly, and he would not stop because he was trying to wear down all of the Republicans who were in Congress at the time. Filibuster. Thank you. He did a filibuster. The reason for it was because they had, there were more Republicans who were able to vote in favor of the Civil Rights Act than they had Democrats to vote against the Civil Rights Act. And he was trying to speak long enough for the Republicans to lose interest and to like go to sleep or leave the chambers or whatever. So he just got up there and talked and talked and talked. The plan was, as soon as the Republicans left and there was enough people in the Democrat side to vote, they would vote it then and then have it voted down. They would vote down the Civil Rights Act. And the Republicans figured it out pretty quickly when this guy started reading through the phone book that they were in a filibuster. He doesn't have to talk about the subject at all. He could talk about anything he wanted to do a filibuster. So the Republicans called for beds to be brought in to the chambers of the Congress, and they basically took naps or whatever, and they stayed on the Capitol Hill campus. They stayed there. And when the vote finally went in, not a single Democrat voted in favor of the Civil Rights Act. It was passed solely by Republicans. The 24th Amendment was the next amendment that's going to be passed, and it did away with poll taxes. Poll taxes were a way to keep people who were poor from voting. And the Black community said, so basically you're talking about us. Now, not every Black person is poor, not even close. And a lot of Black people would be able and willing to pay a poll tax, but they said you're actually voting against anybody that you consider to be poor. And they're looking at a lot of Southern states who had poll taxes specifically to keep Black people from voting. Poll taxes weren't terribly expensive, but they were enough of a problem where you'd have a choice of, you know, do I buy bread, milk, and butter for my family, or do I vote? Okay, so most people would choose the groceries. So 24th Amendment did away with all poll taxes. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 required federal supervision of local elections. This, again, is something that Goldwater would not have agreed with, but President Johnson said, okay, I'm going to sign this because I need to get all of these votes from the Black community. I need to turn them into Democrats. So he signed the Voting Rights Act. The reason for this was because local elections in the South were incredibly dangerous for Black people. They would be sometimes terrorized and forbidden to. There was always a law on the books where it would try to keep Black people from voting. So this required federal supervision of local elections, specifically to help people in the South to vote. Okay, HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was a new cabinet position created by LBJ, And with this new cabinet position came a brand new cabinet secretary, and he is going to be the first Black cabinet secretary ever in American history. And his name is Weaver, I believe. So if everything has that one. HUD poured large amounts of money into inner cities to improve housing and living conditions. And you can see, this is what I was talking about. This is a view from a playground. It's all fenced in and concrete. And of course, these very close together small apartments. So if you want a good, like, popular pop culture idea of what this would have looked like, based on, I'm sorry, but Hollywood, you can watch West Side Story, which takes place in HUD housing. And then also Good Times, which is it's a situation comedy, but man, it'll just tear your heart out and then stomp on it a little bit. So those were two really good examples of what it would have looked like, because they were actually filmed. West Side Story, the opening number, if you can get through the opening number, it's a really good movie. The opening number is so silly, it's embarrassing. You feel embarrassed for the dancers who are trying to act like it's a musical. So you've got a bunch of guys who are supposed to be gang members, but doing some really kind of frou-frou dance moves that, I mean, on stage in a certain type of dance, you wouldn't look ridiculous. But if you're trying to look like a gang member and you're doing these like pirouettes and, arms out extended, you just look ridiculous. So if you can get through that first 30 minutes of West Side Story, it's actually really good. But man, that first 30 minutes is rough. You're just watching it and going, whew, that did not age well. Okay, Robert Weaver, first Black American cabinet member, and he was the Secretary of the Housing and Urban Development position. Our current HUD secretary is also Black. He's a former neurosurgeon, so he's a guy with a lot of brains. He operated on brains, and he has a good brain. And he also ran for president, but he became the first officer of HUD, or became the Secretary of HUD instead. He is qualified specifically because he grew up in housing and urban development apartments, and he will be very clear to say, boy, was that a mess. That was horrible, and I don't think anybody should have to go through that. So let's fix it. Let's fix those problems. Let's get people out of those apartments is what he wants to do. Okay, Thurgood Marshall was also the first Black Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. When he was a young lawyer, he argued the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education case before the Supreme Court. So he became the lawyer in the Brown versus Board of Education case, argued in front of the Supreme Court, and then as an older man, he became the first Black Associate Justice, which is kind of cool. And I want to watch that movie that's based on him. It's called Marshall. I want to see it. I haven't seen it yet, so I can't suggest it. I can just muse out loud that, I might check that out. Maybe you should too, on IMDb. Okay, the Fair Housing Act. It was passed in 1968. It prohibited discrimination in renting or selling houses. And as a small child, I was born in 1967, but as a small child, so 4 or 5 years old, there were still commercials being run on television informing people of this act, saying that it was illegal to refuse to rent to somebody based on their race. I remember those commercials very well. During the civil rights movement, many Southerners resented federal officials telling their state and local governments what to do, and that's specifically about that Voting Act, and also about the issue with integration. And then later on, we're going to talk about busing too, forced busing. And you're going to have a lot of people who are really angry that the federal government is telling their state and local governments what to do, especially in the South. And this is really going to be one of those issues. And this is why Martin Luther King Jr. crossed the aisle to talk to a Democrat president and said, we need to do this on a federal level, because the local governments had already proven that they weren't interested in having any kind of civil rights for the Black community. They had already proven who they really were. They showed their colors. Okay, now the Ku Klux Klan kind of revamped its image. Okay, they had been around since just after the Civil War during the time of Reconstruction. They fell out of favor pretty quickly. When Reconstruction was over, they pretty much stopped a lot of what they were doing. They just got really like just a few people involved with the Ku Klux Klan. And then after World War One, I think it was World War One. Yeah, it was World War One. They basically rebranded themselves as a community group that would keep communities safe and neighborhoods safe and clean. And millions of Americans joined the Ku Klux Klan because they didn't know what it was. They believed what they were telling them, that they were a community group that kept community neighborhoods clean. Well, they didn't realize they were talking about ethnic cleansing, like get rid of all the people of color. As soon as the Ku Klux Klan showed their hand and said, well, we're all about, killing people or torturing people or terrorizing people to get them out of our neighborhoods to clean them up, people immediately dumped their memberships immediately. And their membership went from like 2 million to like 5,000 in just a course of like 5 years. As soon as people understood what they were just like, nope, we don't want anything to do with that. Nuh-uh. So this was a white supremacist group. And then we had the Black Panthers and Nation of Islam. Both of these were Black supremacist groups. And sometimes they did do things that were violent and they went after people and terrorized people. But for the most part, what they did was they just defended themselves. A lot of times it was just defense. The man who was he's in the bottom picture here, that's Malcolm X. He was a firm believer in gun rights for all Americans, but specifically Black Americans, because he was a Black American. That's all he cared about. And his whole thing was, don't let any white person tell you don't have the right to own a gun, because if they start shooting at you, you need to shoot back. And that was how he felt about that. So he's not on the same team, so to speak, as Martin Luther King Jr., who believed in a nonviolent approach. And as a result, he really hated Martin Luther King Jr. for a lot of years because he thought that Martin Luther King Jr. was too mellow, too nonviolent. He wanted things to change quickly. And he really wanted to see Black people and white people in the United States completely separate. He did not believe in racial desegregation at all. He believed that they should be separate. So Malcolm X was the most prominent Black supremacist leader. He felt that MLK's methods, as Martin Luther King Jr., were too peaceful and slow. He wanted to assert Black power, and he called for segregations of the races to preserve Black culture. So he was not a fan of the integration at all. So they were really on opposite sides of the civil rights spectrum. Now, later on, there's going to be a real change in Malcolm X's life, and he is going to say, I think maybe Malcolm X, or I think that MLK was right in some ways. Okay, not every way, because they're not going to be exactly on the same team, but he says, I think maybe he was right in some ways. I think he was doing what he thought was right anyway. Now, in 1965, let's go back to Malcolm X's life. I'm just going to go back one because I'll talk about that. Malcolm X grew up in a preacher's home. His father was away on doing a revival service when he was captured by people who were in the KKK. They strapped him down to a train track, and a train ran over the man and trisected him. When Malcolm's community heard what had happened to one of the local preachers, the white community, because they lived in primarily a white community, the community brought food and things over for the family and issued, they were genuinely upset that this had happened because the KKK people were not from their area. And Malcolm X's first recollections was these were, fairly good people. But then one of the things they brought for the family was a ham, like a big ham. And Malcolm X's mom said, thank you so much. We appreciate you reaching out to us. However, our family does not eat pork products. This was something that they had gathered from the Bible. okay, that the Bible called, ham unclean, or pork unclean. Pigs were unclean animals. That offended those who were giving them food. And they were so offended by the fact that their food was rejected, just the ham, that they worked to get her children away from her. And so Malcolm X was actually removed from his mother's home and put into foster care with a white family. That is disturbing enough. But then while he was in with this family, they discovered he was incredibly intelligent. They made sure he was going to school. He was in an integrated school. And this is long before it became a federal issue that he had to integrate. No, he was just in a neighborhood that had an integrated school. And he was top of his class in every subject. He was brilliant. And the teacher one day at the end of the school year was asking everybody, what do you want to be when you grow up? And everybody was answering, and he said, I want to be a lawyer. And the teacher said, I don't think that's going to happen for you, because you're Black. So maybe you should think about something like carpentry. And he's like, wait a minute. So I'm top of my class. I'm doing all the homework. I'm smarter than every kid in this room. And you're telling me that I can't be a lawyer because of my color? And at that point, he just didn't care about school anymore. Ended up dropping out and working as a person who worked on railways to sell sandwiches and candies on train cars. And that's when he discovered the underworld of drugs. He became the other people who were on the train cars. They would sell sandwiches, but the people who were buying sandwiches were like, do you also have like a little pot, a little cocaine? And they would do drug deals along with selling sandwiches. And he started doing that too. Moved to Boston, got in with a guy, he became friends with a guy who was a thief, and the two of them started robbing houses together. And then he got put in prison for that. And while he was in prison, he was bored. And so he started reading the dictionary and writing down like every word, memorizing it. It's a lot like words, memorizing every word. And when he finished the dictionary, he started all over again. And obviously very, very incredibly intelligent man. But while he was in prison, he met a man who was part of the Nation of Islam, which is, they call themselves Muslim, but they're not really like the Muslim from the Middle East. It's a whole different religious thing. So he converted to Islam through the Nation of Islam and gave up drugs, gave up alcohol, gave up fooling around because, he was kind of a playa, got married, followed Islamic teaching as he knew it, as it was taught by Nation of Islam, and lived really an exemplary life as an Islamic man. And it was while he was in the Nation of Islam that he started speaking out, and he started pushing for the idea that there should be separation of races, because that's one of the things the Nation of Islam teaches. And he was teaching morality. Women need to cover their hair and they need to be wearing certain clothes, and men shouldn't be fooling around on their wives. They should be married to one woman and only sleeping with her. And he was teaching this and preaching this and selling out stadiums. I mean, he was very famous for this. But he also went after Christian Black Americans, because he said, you guys are just following like a white teaching, which Christianity is actually from the same area as Islam. Okay, they're like 300 miles apart where those two religions started. They're really close. But he got to the point where he was looking at the teachers, the head of the Nation of Islam promoted a man to a second in command place. And Malcolm X went to the leader and said, this guy is not a good guy. He has had affairs with multiple women, and he is just not a good guy. He's very corrupt. People can pay him off so they can get away with just about anything. And the guy who was the leader of Nation of Islam was like, oh, he's okay. And then that's when Malcolm X discovered that the leader was living basically the same way. They had multiple women that they were juggling. They were both involved. I mean, it was just a mess. It turned out that the power structure at the very top was extremely corrupt. So Malcolm X walked away from the Nation of Islam. And he talked to his wife, says, I don't know what to do anymore. I found out that the church I believed in was not the way it was supposed to be. I don't know what I'm going to do. I believe in Islam. What do I do? And his wife made the suggestion that he take a trip and he go on the Hijra, which is when you go to, when a Muslim goes to visit Mecca. And so he did that. Well, he had been teaching this whole time that the true Muslim was a black man. He gets to Mecca and he's like one of the only black people there. And he's like, oh my goodness. Like even the most foundational things I was teaching is wrong. And so he actually studied more about Islam while he was in Mecca, came back home, very different, and started to say things like, I think MLK was right in some areas. I think that people can work together. I think that we can have, relationships with people who aren't exactly like us. Maybe I was wrong about a lot of stuff. And as a result, in 1965, the rival black Muslim leaders from Nation of Islam hired gunmen who murdered Malcolm X as he was getting ready to speak to a audience full of people. He was basically telling how he had changed from Nation of Islam. But they shot him, and they shot him to the point where he was long past dead. And the people who were witness to it said his body was just jumping from all the bullets hitting him long after he was obviously dead. But people forgot that he had changed, but they also forgot that he had supported violence at the very beginning. He originally supported violence and racial separation, but later he changed. And so people forget that he was like two sides of the same coin. He really did change. So your book is like, people forget that Malcolm X supported violence and racial separations. Yes, he did, but he also changed his mind about that. So if you really want to find out what Malcolm X was really all about, I strongly suggest you read his autobiography, which was actually written by Alex Haley. Now, autobiography means self-written, but Malcolm X was kind of busy at the time because he had just left Nation of Islam. He was trying to rebuild a following. He was going out and talking wherever he could. So he didn't have a lot of time to sit down and actually write his story. So what he did was he went to Alex Haley's apartment and basically verbally told him his story. And then Alex Haley typed it all out for him. That's what he did. So I strongly suggest you read the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's really worth reading. It's a good book. Okay, we are done for today, and we will pick this up again tomorrow. I hope you guys have an awesome day and that you get a little time to rest and relax as we go through this very quick ending of our school year. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Bye.